Will you marry me? Ethan Cross said it flat. No ring, no flowers, no softness in his voice. Just the truth sitting between them like a stone on the table. Lena Hart set down her coffee pot and looked at him the way a woman looks at a man she's already decided is a fool. She'd heard promises before. Every drifter who came through Red Hollow had one. A dream, a scheme, a reason she should trust him. But this man wasn't promising her anything beautiful. "I'm not going to lie to you," Ethan said. "The house is real, the land is real, the loneliness is real, and I'm asking you anyway." Lena didn't move. Nobody had ever been that honest with her in her entire life. If this story already has your heart, before we go any further, hit that subscribe button right now and follow along until the very end. And drop a comment below telling me what city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story travels. Ethan Cross was not a man who waited for life to come to him. He had learned it the way most men on the frontier learned everything that mattered through loss. His father had waited for the right season to plant the right year to expand the right moment to tell his wife he loved her. And then, one winter came that was colder than any before it, and there was no more waiting to be done. Ethan had stood at that grave at 17 years old and made himself a promise he never spoke aloud to anyone. He would build before he was ready. He would commit before he was certain. He would not wait. So in the spring of 1879, Ethan Cross rode out to a parcel of land in the Wyoming Territory that he'd traded 3 years of cattle wages to claim, and he started building a house. He had no wife to build it for, no children to fill it, no woman who had promised to come. He had lumber nails, a hammer, and a belief so stubborn it bordered on foolishness that if a man built something real, something solid, life had a way of finding its way into it. The first week, 2 men from the nearest settlement rode out to watch him work. One of them, a weathered rancher named Cobb, leaned against his horse and called out to him. "What are you building out here, Cross?" "A house," Ethan said without stopping. "For who?" "Don't know yet." Cobb looked at the other man. The other man shook his head. They rode away without another word, and Ethan could hear them laughing from halfway across the plain. He didn't stop hammering. He worked through rain. He worked through cold that cracked the skin on his knuckles until they bled. He worked through days when the wind came off the mountain so hard it blew his work over and he had to start sections again from nothing. He talked to nobody. He ate alone. He measured twice and cut once and stood back at the end of each day to look at what he'd built and ask himself if it was good enough. It never felt good enough. But he kept going anyway. By late summer, the house stood. 4 rooms, a solid roof, a front porch wide enough for 2 chairs side by side, a fireplace he'd laid himself stone by stone from rock he'd hauled up from the creek bed a quarter-mile away. Ethan stood on that porch the evening it was finished and looked out at the empty prairie stretching in every direction. The silence was so complete he could hear his own heartbeat. And standing in that silence with the house solid behind him and nothing but open land ahead, he felt something he hadn't expected. Not pride, not peace. Something closer to grief, because the house was real and there was nobody in it. He sat down on the top porch step. He stayed there a long time, and when he finally stood up, something had shifted in him, the kind of shift a man feels when he stops pretending a decision hasn't already been made. He was going to ride into Red Hollow and find a wife. He told himself it was practical. A ranch this size needed 2 sets of hands. The winters were brutal, and a man alone was a man at risk. There were logical reasons. He rehearsed them in his head on the 3-day ride into town, listing them out the way a man lists supplies before a long trip. Practical, sensible, necessary. He believed maybe half of it. Red Hollow was the kind of town that happened to places, not the kind that was planned. It had grown up around a trading post and a saloon and hadn't improved much since. The main street was wide enough for wagons to pass each other, and that was about the only thing anyone had agreed to do right. The buildings leaned. The boardwalk buckled in 3 places. The church had no steeple because the steeple had blown off 2 winters ago, and nobody had gotten around to putting it back. But it had people, and people meant women, And women meant the possibility that one of them, just one, might be willing to hear what he had to say. He started at the general store. The owner's wife listened to him describe the land, the house, the life he was offering, and then she put both hands flat on the counter and said, "Mr. Cross, I appreciate your honesty, but I wouldn't send my worst enemy out to live that far from civilization." He tried the boarding house next. The woman who ran it looked him up and down and asked how old he was. 31, he told her. She asked if he had money. Some, he said. She asked how far the nearest town was from his land. 3 days' ride. She closed the door before he finished the sentence. He asked every woman who would speak to him. He was not a man who embarrassed easily, which was fortunate because the rejections came fast and without kindness. One woman laughed. Not meanly, but the way a person laughs when something is so far from possible, it strikes them as almost funny. Another walked away while he was still talking. A third listened politely and then explained very gently that she had 3 children and a mother to care for, and a man who worked at the mill, and that even if none of that were true, she was not the kind of woman who rode off into the wilderness with a stranger. By the 3rd evening in Red Hollow, Ethan sat at a corner table in the only diner in town and stared at a cup of coffee he'd ordered and hadn't touched. He was not a man who gave up on things easily. But he was beginning to wonder whether he had misread the situation so completely that the belief he'd been carrying, that belief he'd poured into every board and nail of that house, had been nothing but a story he'd told himself to keep loneliness from crushing him flat. He picked up the coffee. He drank it. He told himself he'd try 2 more days. And that was when he noticed the waitress. She wasn't doing anything remarkable. She was carrying plates from the kitchen to a table of miners near the window, and she moved the way people move when they've been on their feet for too many hours. Efficient, economical, no motion wasted. She set the plates down and answered a question from one of the miners without looking up. And then she turned back toward the kitchen, and Ethan saw her face clearly for the first time. She wasn't young in the way that made men look twice on the street. She was maybe 28, 29. She had dark hair pinned back in a way that was practical rather than pretty. She had the kind of face that told a story without saying a word. Not a happy story, not a tragic one either. Just the face of a person who had learned to expect exactly what life had given her and nothing more. What stopped Ethan was her eyes. He caught them for half a second before she looked away. And in that half second, he saw something he recognized, the way you recognize a landmark you've only ever heard, described, something careful, something watchful, something that was stronger than it looked, and knew it, and didn't want anyone else to find out. He watched her work for another 20 minutes. He watched how she handled the miners when they got too familiar, calm, immediate, no drama, no fear. He watched how she checked on the older couple by the door without being asked. He watched how she counted her tips behind the counter quickly, privately, and then tucked them into her apron with an expression that was not quite gratitude and not quite relief. He didn't know her name. He didn't know a single thing about her, but something in his chest that had been quiet for 3 days said clearly and without drama, that one. He told himself he was being ridiculous. He ordered another coffee. She brought it without looking at him. He said thank you. She nodded once and moved on. He sat there another half hour, working up the courage to say something, and nearly talked himself out of it entirely. What would he say? Everything he'd said to every other woman in this town and been turned away for. She would say no. She probably had a life here. She probably had people, a plan. A reason she didn't need a stranger walking in with a half-baked offer and a house 3 days from anywhere. He almost stood up and left. He had his hand on the edge of the table. Then one of the miners near the window said something to her low. The kind of thing said low, so only she could hear it, and Ethan watched her face. She didn't flinch. She didn't react the way most women reacted, with color in the cheeks or a quick retreat. She looked at that man with an expression so controlled it was almost frightening, and she said 2 words Ethan couldn't hear from across the room, and the miner looked away first. Ethan sat back down. He waited until she came to refill his coffee. "What's your name?" he asked. She paused with the pot halfway to his cup. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the miner, measuring, assessing, deciding how much she needed to engage. Lena, she said. Lena Hart. I'm Ethan Cross. Good for you, she said, and finished pouring. He almost laughed. Can I ask you something? You're going to whether I say yes or not. Fair enough. He wrapped both hands around the cup. Are you happy here? The pot stopped moving. She looked at him, really looked at him this time, not the quick measuring look, but something longer, something that went behind his eyes and came back with information she didn't share. Then she said, That's a strange question from a man I don't know. I know, he said. I'm going to ask you something stranger in a minute. I just wanted to ask that one first. She set the coffee pot down on his table. She crossed her arms, and she looked at him with an expression that was halfway between annoyance and the particular attention a person gives something that has surprised them against their will. What do you want, Mr. Cross? Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he told her the truth. He told her about the land, about the house, about the 3 years of wages and the months of building, and the finished porch, and the 2 chairs, and the fireplace he'd laid by hand. He told her about the distance from the nearest town. He told her about the winters. He told her that the work would be hard, and the life would be isolated, and that he had nothing romantic to say about it because he didn't believe in dressing up reality to make it easier to swallow. He told her he was looking for a woman who would come out there and build a life with him. Not a woman who wanted to be saved. Not a woman who was looking for comfort. A woman who needed a reason, a real one, and a place to put her strength. Lena Hart stood at his table and listened to all of it without interrupting. Her face gave him nothing. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment. Then she said, You rode into town and proposed to every woman who'd listen to you. Yes, he said. And they all said no. Yes. And now you're down to the waitress. I'm not down to anything, Ethan said, and there was something in his voice that wasn't pride and wasn't apology. I noticed you specifically. I've been watching you work for an hour. You handle yourself different than anyone else in this room and you know it. I'm not trying to flatter you. I don't know how to do that. I'm just telling you what I saw. Lena looked at him a long time. The diner noise continued around them, the clatter of plates, the voices of other tables, the cook calling something from the back. She didn't seem to hear any of it. What makes you think I'd want to leave? She finally said. Nothing, Ethan said. I don't know anything about your life. Maybe you've got everything you need right here. Maybe you'd never consider it. I'm asking anyway because I've learned not to make assumptions about what people want. He paused. And because you didn't look happy when I asked. Something moved across her face. It was quick, the kind of thing that came and went before it could be analyzed. But Ethan saw it, and he didn't look away. I've got nowhere to be in the morning, he said. If you want to talk more, I'll be at breakfast. He left money on the table more than the coffee cost and stood up. He picked up his hat. Mr. Cross, Lena said. He turned around. She was looking at him with that careful, watchful expression, the one that was stronger than it looked. Why did you build the house before you had anyone to build it for? Ethan put on his hat. Because I decided I wasn't going to wait for my life to start, he said. I was going to build it and let life figure out the rest. He walked out of the diner. Behind him, Lena Hart stood very still with the coffee pot in her hand, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she was thinking about something other than getting through the day. She was thinking about a house on the prairie she had never seen. She was thinking about a man who had built it before he knew who it was for. And she was thinking in the part of herself she had spent years learning to silence that she had been waiting too, not for something better, just for a reason, a real one, the kind of reason a person didn't walk away from twice. The cook called her name from the back. She picked up the pot and walked toward the kitchen, but her hands for just a moment were not entirely steady. She didn't sleep that night. Lena Hart lay on the narrow cot in the back room of the boarding house where she'd rented a space for the past 14 months, and she stared at the ceiling and thought about a man who had built a house for nobody. A man who had driven nails into wood and hauled stone from a creek bed and framed a front porch with 2 chairs. 2 chairs as if he'd already decided there would be someone to sit in the second one before he had a single person to build it for. She thought about that, and she thought about the way he'd said it. Not like a man selling something. Not like a man trying to charm his way into a yes. Just flat, honest, the way a person reads a weather report here is what is true. Here is what I am offering, here is what it will cost you. She had been lied to by men who sounded exactly like that. Men whose honesty was itself a performance, whose plain-spokenness was a tool they'd learned to use because plain-spoken men got trusted faster. She knew the type. She had married one. That thought came the way it always came, without warning, and with enough weight to press the breath out of her chest for a second. She pushed it down, pressed it flat the way she'd gotten good at pressing things flat, and told herself she was not going to that breakfast. She was at the diner by 7:15. Ethan was already there at the same corner table with a cup of coffee and his hat on the seat beside him. He looked up when she walked in. He didn't smile. He didn't wave. He just looked at her and then looked back down at his coffee, and that was somehow more unsettling than any greeting would have been. She sat down across from him. For a moment, neither of them said anything. "You came," he finally said. "I almost didn't." "I know. You look like a woman who argued with herself all the way here." She looked at him sharply. He wasn't smiling when he said it. He was just stating a fact, which made it worse somehow, because it meant he was paying attention in a way most men didn't bother to. "I need to ask you something," Lena said. "All right. Why me?" "And I don't want the answer you gave me last night. I want the real one." Ethan set his cup down. He looked at her with that direct, unhurried attention she was already beginning to recognize as simply the way he looked at things, as if he had nowhere else to be and no interest in pretending otherwise. "You handled that minor," he said. "The one by the window who said something he shouldn't have." She waited. "You didn't flinch. You didn't look for help. You didn't make a scene. You handled it like a woman who's learned that the only person who's going to solve her problems is herself." He picked up his coffee. "That's not something you learn in a comfortable life, Lena." The way he said her name plain without decoration did something she wasn't prepared for. She kept her face still. She was good at keeping her face still. "You don't know anything about my life," she said. "No," he agreed. "I don't. I'm not pretending I do. I'm telling you what I saw." He paused. "And I'm asking if any part of what I said last night made you think." She was quiet for a moment. The morning diner was filling up around them. Boots on the floorboards. The smell of bacon and coffee and wood smoke. She had served breakfast in this room every day for 14 months, and she had stopped really seeing it a long time ago. "I was married," she said. Ethan didn't move. "Before. In Missouri. I was married for 3 years." She said it evenly, the way she'd learned to say things that needed saying, without letting them take anything from her on the way out. "He died. That's not the part that mattered. The part that mattered is what those 3 years were." She looked at him. "So when a man sits down and tells me he's honest, and his house is real and his offer is genuine, you'll understand if I've heard that before." "I understand," Ethan said. "Do you?" "I can't prove I'm different than whoever he was. I know that." He held her gaze. "I can only tell you what I'm offering, and you can measure that against what you know about men who lie. If it sounds like lying, you walk away. I won't try to stop you." Lena studied him. She had spent 3 years learning to read the space between what a man said and what he meant, and she was better at it now than she wished she had to be. She looked for the performance in him. The calculation. The angle. She didn't find it. That scared her more than finding it would have. "Tell me about the house," she said, and he did. He told her everything he'd told her the night before, but this time she listened differently, not for what to push back on, but for the details a man invented versus the details a man remembered. He remembered everything. The grain of the lumber, the exact weight of the stones from the creek, the way the porch faced, and why. He talked about it the way a person talks about something their hands have touched 1,000 times. When he stopped, she said, "How far is the nearest doctor?" 2 days' ride. Nearest town with a market. 3 days. Nearest woman I could talk to who isn't you. Something shifted at the corner of his mouth, not quite a smile, but something adjacent to it. There's a settlement 15 miles east, couple of families. The Garrett woman I've been told is good company and not afraid to speak her mind. You've been told. I haven't met her, but I asked before I came here because I figured that'd be a question. Lena blinked. She had not expected that. He had anticipated the question written out to get an answer before he even knew who he'd be asking. Something about that, the quiet, methodical care of it, settled into a place in her chest that she would have preferred to keep empty. What do you want from a wife? She asked. And don't say partnership. Every man says partnership. I want someone who'll tell me when I'm wrong, Ethan said immediately. I want someone who means what she says. I want someone who'll treat the house like it's hers because it would be. And I want someone who'll still be there in 10 years, not because she has nowhere to go, but because she chose to stay. The silence after that was different from the silences before it. Lena looked down at her hands on the table. She thought about Missouri. She thought about 14 months in Red Hollow, waking up every morning to a job that paid enough to survive, and not enough to leave, to a life that fit like a coat 2 sizes too small. She thought about the thing she hadn't told him. The thing she hadn't told anyone in this town. The thing that woke her up sometimes at 3 in the morning with her heart already running. She thought about whether she was going to keep running, or whether just once she was going to do something that wasn't about escape. She looked up. I need 3 days to think about it, she said. All right, Ethan said. And I need you to understand that if I say no, that's the end of the conversation. Understood. And if I say yes... She stopped. She started again. If I say yes, I'm not coming as your charity case. I'm not coming because I have nowhere else to go. If I come, it's because I've decided the terms are fair. You'd need to treat it that way. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. I wouldn't have it any other way, he said. He meant it. She could hear that he meant it, which was the most dangerous thing that had happened to her in 3 years. She stood up. She picked up her apron from the back of the chair where she'd set it. When she sat down, she hadn't officially started her shift yet, had come on her own time to have this conversation, and she tied it around her waist. 3 days, she said. I'll be here, Ethan said. She walked back toward the kitchen. She did not look back. But her mind was already doing the thing she hadn't let it do in 14 months. It was calculating, measuring, turning something over and over to see what it weighed. She was still doing it that evening when a man walked into the diner she hadn't expected to see in Red Hollow ever again. He sat down in the corner. He ordered coffee. And he looked at her across the room with the kind of look that said he had not come here for the coffee. His name was Roy Castor. He had been her husband's business partner in Missouri, and the last time she had seen him, she had been running. Lena's hands went still on the plate she was carrying. She set it down at the wrong table. The man sitting there looked up in surprise. She apologized without hearing herself apologize. She kept her face smooth and her breathing even, and she walked back toward the kitchen and stood behind the door for 30 seconds with her eyes closed and her hands pressed flat against her thighs. Roy Castor had found her. She didn't know how. She had changed her name when she left Missouri. Hart was her mother's name, not her married name. She had told nobody where she was going. She had moved twice before Red Hollow, each time going farther west, each time choosing a smaller town. She had been careful. She had been so careful. She opened her eyes. She walked back out into the diner. She looked at Roy Castor, and he looked at her, and she picked up a coffee pot and walked to his table and filled his cup like he was anybody else. "Hello, Clara," he said quietly. "I think you have me confused with someone," she said. "Clara Jean Maddox," Roy said. "Douglas Maddox's wife. My name is Lena Hart." She set the pot down on the table, hard enough that the coffee sloshed. "And if you'd like to keep sitting here, I'd suggest you let this go right now." Roy wrapped both hands around his cup. He was a compact, careful man, mid-40s, neat in the way of someone who thought neatness conveyed respectability. He had always made Lena's skin crawl, and she had never been able to explain to Douglas why, and Douglas had never been interested in hearing it anyway. "I don't want trouble," Roy said. "Then you should have stayed in Missouri." "Douglas left debts," Roy said. "You know that. The creditors know it too. And what some of them have started to figure out is that the land Douglas registered in your name before he died is still registered that way. Which means the debt is technically nothing," Lena said low and even. "Because I signed nothing. I agreed to nothing. I knew nothing about what Douglas was doing with those men, and you know that as well as I do." "What I know and what can be proven are two different things." Lena looked at him. She looked at him the way she'd looked at the miner who'd said the wrong thing, the way she'd learned to look at men who thought they had leverage directly, without blinking, without giving them the fear they were fishing for. "What do you want, Roy?" He reached into his jacket and took out a folded piece of paper. He set it on the table between them. "Sign that and this goes away. The land transfers to the creditors and you're free." Lena didn't touch the paper. "And if I don't? Then they send someone with a court document and it gets a lot less friendly." She looked at the paper. She looked at Roy. And she thought very clearly, with the particular clarity that comes to a person when they have no time to be afraid, that she had exactly two choices. Sign a document she didn't understand, clearing a debt she hadn't made giving up land she hadn't known she owned. Or don't sign and wait for whatever came next. She picked up the coffee pot. "I need to think about it," she said. Roy nodded. He stood up. He left money on the table more than the coffee cost, which felt like an insult, like he was paying her in advance for something. "I'll be at the Hollowell Hotel until Friday." He walked out. Lena stood in the middle of the diner with her coffee pot, and her pulse hammering in her ears, and her face completely composed, because composure was the only currency she had left. She finished her shift. She cleared tables. She answered questions. She carried plates and filled cups and smiled at the old couple by the door. And when the diner closed at 9, she walked straight to the boarding house and sat on her cot and unfolded the paper she had picked up off Roy's table while pretending to wipe it down. She read it. She read it twice. She didn't understand all the legal language, but she understood enough this wasn't just about the land. There was a liability clause at the bottom written in smaller print that would transfer Douglas's remaining commercial debts to her as the surviving registered property owner. She would be signing not just the land away, but agreeing to a debt that was not hers. Roy had lied, smoothly and completely the way Douglas had taught him. She sat with that for a long time. She thought about the fact that Roy had found her here in Red Hollow, in a town she'd chosen specifically because it was far enough from everything that nobody from her old life would follow. And if he'd found her here, he'd follow her anywhere she went that was close enough to civilization to have an address. Unless she went somewhere there was no address to follow. Unless she went somewhere so far from the legal machinery of Missouri that a document like this couldn't reach her for long enough that she could figure out how to fight it. She sat for a long time. Then she thought about a man who had built a house before he had anyone to build it for. Who had answered questions she hadn't asked yet. Who had looked at her across a diner table and said, "I want someone who'll still be there in 10 years. Not because she has nowhere to go. Because she chose to stay. She thought about whether what she was considering was a choice or a flight. She sat with that longer. She was honest with herself in a way she hadn't been in years because the situation demanded it. Part of her was still running. She knew that. Part of saying yes to Ethan Cross would be stepping out of Roy Castor's reach, and she could not pretend otherwise. But part of it, the part that had sat across from him at that table this morning and listened to him describe 2 chairs on a porch, was something that had nothing to do with Roy at all. She had been existing for 14 months. She had been careful and quiet and invisible, and she had survived, and survival was nothing to be ashamed of, but it was not a life. She had been waiting for long enough that she'd forgotten she was waiting. She folded Roy's paper and put it in her coat pocket. She was not going to sign it, and she was not going to be in Red Hollow on Friday. She found Ethan at the livery stable the next morning, checking on his horse before the day started. She walked in and stood behind him and said his name. He turned around. He looked at her face, and whatever he saw there made him straighten up slowly. "You've made a decision," he said. "Yes," she said. "But before I tell you what it is, I need to tell you something first. And when I tell you, you're going to want to change your mind about me. I need you to hear it all the way through before you say anything." Ethan said nothing. He just looked at her with that steady, unhurried attention and waited. Lena told him, not everything, not the deepest parts, not yet, but enough. She told him about Douglas, about the debts, about the land she hadn't known was in her name. She told him about Roy Castor sitting at her table last night. She told him that if she left Red Hollow with him, she was not only a woman building a new life, she was a woman with a past that had legs, and those legs might eventually walk as far as Wyoming. When she finished, she waited for the thing she'd seen in men's faces before. The calculation, the reassessment, the quiet withdrawal dressed up as sympathy. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Is the debt actually yours?" "No," she said. "Legally, I don't know, but morally, no." "And this Roy Castor, is he dangerous?" Lena thought about it honestly. "He's not violent. He uses paper. He uses leverage. He's the kind of man who makes things complicated and expensive and exhausting." "Will paper reach Wyoming territory in 1879? She blinked. "Technically," Ethan said. "The territorial court system out there is 4 years old. It's overwhelmed. A civil debt claim from Missouri filed against a woman with a different name for land she may or may not legally own that's going to sit at the bottom of a very long pile." He looked at her steadily. "I'm not saying there's no risk. I'm saying the risk is a lot smaller than it probably feels right now." Lena stared at him. "You thought about this already," she said slowly. "I thought about the kinds of things a woman running from something might have running after her," Ethan said. It seemed relevant to think through. She didn't have words for what she felt in that moment. It wasn't gratitude exactly. It was something older than gratitude. The thing a person feels when they've been carrying something alone for so long that having another person acknowledge the weight of it, even for a second, unmoors them entirely. She got herself back together in 3 seconds. She was good at that. "My answer is yes," she said. Ethan nodded. He didn't whoop. He didn't reach for her. He just nodded the way a man nods when something he believed would happen has finally happened. "We should leave by tomorrow morning," he said, "before your man from Missouri starts asking around. I'll need tonight to settle my accounts at the boarding house. I'll get the supplies." She turned to leave. She stopped. "Ethan?" He looked up. "If I come," she said, "I'm going to argue with you sometimes." "Good," he said, "and I'm not going to thank you every day for giving me a house." "I'd be insulted if you did," he said. "It's your house." She walked out of the livery stable into the sharp morning air and stood still for a moment. Something that had been wound tight in her chest for 14 months, maybe longer, was for the first time in longer than she could measure, very slightly less tight. She had one day to close a chapter and start something she could not fully see. She went back to the diner and she worked her last shift in Red Hollow, and she didn't tell anyone she was leaving. And when the owner paid her at the end of the night, she thanked him without explanation and walked out. She walked past Roy Castor's hotel without slowing down. She packed everything she owned into a bag that wasn't heavy enough to justify how much it had cost her to fill it. She lay down on the cot. She told herself to sleep. She didn't sleep. But when the first gray light came through the window, she was dressed and her bag was on her shoulder and she was ready. And whatever she was walking toward, whatever it turned out to be in the end, she was not walking away from it. She was walking toward it, for the first time in 3 years. That was the difference. It was small and it was enormous, and she carried it with her out into the morning like it was the only thing she owned that was truly hers. Ethan was waiting at the edge of town with 2 horses and a loaded pack mule when Lena arrived at first light, her bag over one shoulder and her face set in the particular way of a person who has made a decision and is not going to revisit it. He looked at her bag, then at her. He didn't say anything about how small the bag was, which she appreciated more than he would ever know. "Ready?" he asked. "Ask me again in 3 days," she said, and swung up onto the horse he'd saddled for her without waiting for help. They rode out of Red Hollow in silence. Behind them, the town was just beginning to wake smoke from chimneys. A dog barking somewhere, the distant clang of the blacksmith's first hammer of the morning. Lena did not look back. She had spent enough of her life looking back at things that were already gone. For the first hour, they didn't speak. Ethan rode slightly ahead, not leading, just comfortable in silence, in a way that felt natural rather than dismissive. She watched him without being obvious about it. The way he sat a horse, the way he checked the horizon periodically without making a production of it. He was a man who had spent a lot of time alone, and alone had not made him restless or strange. It had just made him quiet in a way that had nothing to hide in it. She had not been around that kind before. She wasn't sure what to do with it. The sun climbed and the air warmed, and eventually Ethan slowed his horse until they were riding side by side. He pulled a piece of dried biscuit from his jacket pocket, broke it in half without looking, and held her half out without a word. She took it. She ate it. She said, "When did you plan to tell me that we'd be sleeping on open ground for 3 nights? I thought you knew." "You thought I knew. You asked about the distance to the house. I said 3 days' ride. I assumed there were towns in between. There's a settlement at the end of day 1. We can stay there if you'd rather." Lena thought about Roy Castor, about whether a man like Roy would think to ask at settlements along the road west. "Open ground is fine," she said. Ethan glanced at her. "You sure?" "I've slept in worse places than outdoors," she said, and offered nothing further. He didn't ask. That was something she was already adding to a private list, the things Ethan Cross did not do. He did not ask for more than what was offered. He did not push on closed doors. He answered questions directly, and then stopped talking, which was so unlike Douglas, that it occasionally made her feel she was watching a species she hadn't encountered before. By midday, they had left the last recognizable marks of Red Hollow behind them, and the land had opened up into that particular enormity that either broke people or remade them. Lena had crossed open land before, but always with the feeling of being exposed, of being small and visible in a way that was dangerous. Riding beside Ethan, the feeling was different. Not safe exactly. She didn't trust safe anymore, but something closer to possible. "Can I ask you something?" she said. "You're going to whether I say yes or not," Ethan said. She looked at him. He was looking straight ahead, but she could see the corner of his mouth. It took her a moment to realize he was using her own words from that first morning back at her. She chose not to show how much that landed. "Your family," she said. "Where are they?" "Gone," he said, simply, without self-pity. "My mother went first. I was 12. My father held on until I was 17 and then decided he was done. I'm sorry." "Don't be. My father's death is what made me who I am. I'm not sure I'd trade it." He paused. "The grief, maybe, but not the change it made in me." Lena thought about that. "Mine made me smaller," she said before she could think better of it. "My husband's death. I don't mean I missed him. I didn't, not the way a person should. But losing him made me contract, pull in, like a thing trying not to get hit again." She hadn't meant to say all of that. She felt it hanging between them and braced for him to respond the way people responded to that kind of honesty, with discomfort dressed up as sympathy. "That makes sense," Ethan said. "When something hits hard enough, you brace. Takes a while before you believe the next hit isn't coming." "How do you know that?" "Because that's what I did after my father died." He glanced at her. "Took me 4 years before I stopped expecting the worst out of every situation. And then one day I woke up, and it wasn't the worst I was expecting. It was just whatever was going to happen." Lena rode beside him and turned that over. "And that's when you decided to build the house?" "About a year after that," he said. "Yeah." The conversation settled back into silence, but it was different from the silence before. Something had been said that couldn't be unsaid, and neither of them needed to comment on it. which was, she was beginning to realize something. Ethan Cross was unusually good at letting things be what they were without requiring them to be explained. She was adding that to the list too. They made good time through the afternoon. Ethan set a pace that was steady without being punishing, and he stopped twice to water the horses without being asked, which told her he'd done this trip enough times to know exactly where to stop. When the light started going flat and orange, he began looking for a place to camp, and when he found it, he swung down and started unloading the pack mule with the efficient, practiced movements of a man who needed no help but would accept it if offered. She tied her horse and helped. He didn't remark on it. They ate beside a small fire salt pork and hardtack and water from a canvas bag, and the silence between them was so unremarkable that Lena had the strange sensation of having eaten 1,000 meals beside this man without having eaten any. Then Ethan said, "Tell me about the land." She looked up. "The land in Missouri," he said. "You said you didn't know it was registered in your name. Do you know what it is? How much?" What? She hadn't expected him to circle back to that. But she answered because she'd already decided she was going to be honest with this man, or she wasn't going to be anything with him at all. 40 acres, east of Jefferson City. Douglas bought it 2 years before he died, I thought, with his own money, which I know now was not his own money. She paused. I never saw it. He didn't take me. And Castor wants you to sign it to the creditors. With a debt clause attached. Ethan was quiet for a moment. Don't sign it, he said. I wasn't going to. Good. He poked at the fire. That clause is fraudulent. What he's trying to do, transfer a commercial debt to a spouse who wasn't party to the original agreement that's not legal in Missouri or anywhere else. He's counting on you not knowing that. Lena stared at him. How do you know that? I had a dispute with a land broker 4 years ago, Ethan said. I spent 3 months learning everything I could about property law in this territory and the ones bordering it because I wasn't going to lose my land to someone who knew more about paper than I did. He looked at her. Knowledge is the only weapon that doesn't run out. She looked at him for a long moment. She had the distinct vertiginous feeling of standing on a floor she'd believed was solid and discovering it was solid, not shaking, not crumbling, just genuinely, unexpectedly solid, which was its own kind of shock when you'd been braced for it to give way. You keep doing that, she said. Doing what? Being more than I thought you were going to be. He held her gaze. That's because you keep thinking I'm going to be less. She couldn't argue with that. She looked away first. She slept better than she had in months. She didn't examine why. The second day was harder. The terrain shifted under them, and the wind picked up, and by midday, Lena's back ached, and her legs ached, and she was profoundly grateful she hadn't said any of that out loud until Ethan stopped the horses and said without preamble, You're riding too stiff. You're fighting the horse instead of moving with it. Loosen your hips. She gave him a look that could have stripped paint. I'm not criticizing, he said. You're doing fine. You just look like you're about to break something. I'm not about to break anything, she said. All right. He started riding again. 2 minutes later, she consciously loosened her hips the way he'd described, and the difference was so immediate and so significant that she had to keep her face completely neutral to avoid admitting he was right. He didn't say anything. He knew. She could see it in the set of his shoulders. She decided she would address that, never. It was late in the second afternoon when they came over a rise, and Ethan pulled his horse up short. She pulled up beside him. Ahead on the trail stood 3 men on horseback, not moving, just positioned across the trail in a way that had no casual explanation. Lena's pulse went from 60 to 120 in about a second. Ethan did not reach for his rifle. He sat very still and assessed the way a man assesses something he's encountered before and has a protocol for. Then he said quietly, Stay beside me. Don't reach for anything. Let me do the talking first. Do you know them? No, but I know the formation. They rode forward at a walk. The 3 men watched them come. 2 of them were young, early 20s, the kind of young that was more dangerous than old because it didn't fully believe in consequences yet. The third was older, 40-something. He had the kind of face that had been making and breaking calculations for a long time. "Afternoon," Ethan said when they were 10 feet away. Conversational, unbothered. "Afternoon," the older man said. "You folks look like you've been riding a while." "A day and a half," Ethan said. "Where you headed?" "Wyoming Territory. I've got a ranch about a day out." The older man looked at Lena. Something in that look made her want to move backward. She didn't move. "That's a long ride for a woman," the older man said. "She's fine," Ethan said. "No heat in it, just flat and final." The older man smiled. It was the smile of a man who had decided something before the conversation started. "Here's the situation," he said. "Trail tax, $1 a head too for the pack animal." Ethan looked at him. "This is open territory," Ethan said. "There's no trail tax." "There is now." One of the young ones shifted his horse slightly to the left opening angle. The other didn't move, but his hand dropped closer to his belt. These were not random drifters. They had a practiced arrangement. Lena looked at Ethan. His face was still and completely unreadable. He reached slowly into his jacket. All three men tensed. He pulled out a coin purse, counted out coins methodically, and held them out to the older man. The man reached forward and took them, and then Ethan said very quietly, "You should know that the Territorial Marshal's office in Casper has been tracking 3 men matching your description for armed extortion on this trail for the last 6 weeks. The reward for information leading to an arrest is currently $20 per head." He paused. "I'm telling you that as a courtesy, not as a threat." The older man's smile did not move, but something behind his eyes recalculated at considerable speed. "Ride on," the man said. They rode. Lena kept her horse at the same pace as Ethan, steady, unhurried, as if they had all the time in the world, until they were far enough that the 3 men behind them were no longer visible. Then she said, "Was that true about the marshal?" "Some of it," Ethan said. She stared at him. "Which part?" "There are men being tracked for extortion on these trails. Whether those were them, I don't know." He glanced at her. "But they didn't know I didn't know." Lena exhaled. "You just lied to 3 armed men to get us past them." "I gave them a reason to let us pass that was better for everyone than the alternative." "Is that what that was?" "Worked, didn't it?" She looked at him for a long moment. He was watching the trail ahead, his face back to its ordinary expression of calm attention, as if what had just happened had been as unremarkable as watering the horses. She thought about what Douglas would have done in that situation. She pushed that thought away. It wasn't a fair comparison, and she knew it. But she filed this moment in the same place she'd been filing all the other moments: the broken biscuit, the loosened hips, the property law, in the place where she kept the evidence. Where she kept the things she was slowly, cautiously allowing herself to believe. The third day started clear and turned complicated by afternoon when the pack mule threw a shoe on rough ground and they lost an hour to it, which put them behind schedule and pushed the arrival at the house past sunset. Ethan fixed the shoe himself efficiently without drama, and when they were riding again, he said matter-of-factly, "We'll get there after dark." "Is that a problem?" "Not for me," he said. "Might be strange for you. First time you see the house." Lena thought about that. Seeing a house for the first time in the dark. A house that was now by some legal fact, she still hadn't fully absorbed hers. "Is there a lamp?" "2," he said. "Then it's not a problem." But as the hours passed and the light dropped and the stars came out enormous and indifferent above them, Lena found herself doing something she hadn't planned on. She found herself getting nervous. Not afraid, nervous. The specific, unwelcome nervousness of a person approaching something they have wanted without letting themselves know they wanted it. And now, here it is. And what if? What if the house is wrong? What if the life is wrong? What if she is the wrong person for this, for him, for any of it? She got hold of that. She pressed it down. She breathed. Ethan said from beside her, "You've gone quiet." "I was quiet before." "Different quiet," he said. "That's the thinking quiet." "Is there a problem with thinking?" Not at all. Just noticing. He paused. We're about 20 minutes out. Her heart did something unhelpful. Okay, she said. Lena. She looked at him. In the dark, she could see his profile and not much more. He was looking straight ahead, but his voice was different from his usual voice, not softer exactly, but more deliberate, like a man choosing each word and meaning it. Whatever you think when you see it, he said, that's allowed. If it's smaller than you expected, that's allowed. If it's not what you imagined, that's allowed. It's just a house. We can change things. She didn't know what to say. She said, You're not what I expected. He was quiet for a moment. Good, he said. Or bad. I haven't decided yet. He accepted that without comment. They rode the last 20 minutes in silence, and when the shape of the house appeared against the sky darker than the dark around it, a solid square of shadow against the stars, Lena pulled her horse to a stop without meaning to. She sat and looked at it. Just the shape. Just the outline of 4 walls and a roof and the edge of a porch. It was real. That was the thing she kept coming back to. The man beside her had ridden into a frontier town with nothing to offer but honesty and a finished house, and this was the house, and it was real, and she was here. Come on, Ethan said quietly, and he rode forward, and after a moment she followed. He lit the lamps. She stood in the middle of the main room and looked at what he'd built. It was plain. It was solidly made. Everything was where it should be, and nothing was decorative, and the fireplace was exactly as he'd described it, stone by stone, laid by hand, a good deep firebox, a proper mantel. The table was rough-hewn but level. The chairs were sturdy. The floorboards didn't creak except in one corner near the door, and when she stepped on it and looked up, Ethan said without being asked, I know about that one. Need to re-nail 2 boards. I'll do it this week. She walked through the house slowly. He didn't follow her. He stayed in the main room and let her move through it alone, which was exactly right, which was becoming a pattern she was struggling to find the edge of. She came back to the main room. She stood in the middle of it. It's good, she said. Ethan was leaning against the fireplace. Yeah, he said. The fireplace is very good. Something in him settled. She could see it, a slight release in the set of his shoulders, something he had been holding that he was now allowing himself to put down. He had been nervous about her seeing the house. This large, quiet, self-sufficient man who had faced down 3 armed strangers on a trail without blinking had been nervous about what she thought of his fireplace. That undid her more than anything that had come before. When do we have to go to the justice of the peace? She asked. Her voice was steady. She was proud of it. Closest one is in the settlement 15 miles east, Ethan said. Day after tomorrow if you're willing. Give you a day to rest first. I don't need a day to rest. All right, tomorrow then. She nodded. She looked at her hands. She looked up at him. I have something to tell you, she said. Something I didn't tell you before. Ethan waited. She told him about Douglas. The real version, not the summary she'd given him in the livery stable, but the full account. She told him about the first year that had seemed like a life, and the second year that had shown her it was a performance, and the third year that she did not describe in detail because some things did not need full description to be understood. She told him that she had not left when she should have, and that she had stayed for reasons that had seemed like courage at the time, and that she understood now had been fear wearing courage's clothing. She told him that she was afraid she had stayed so long in survival mode that she might not know how to do anything else, that she might not know how to actually live somewhere with someone without waiting for the floor to give way. She looked at him when she was done. She was braced. Ethan said, How long ago did you leave Missouri? 14 months. And in those 14 months did the floor give way? No, she said. Did you survive them? Yes. Then you know how to survive. That's not nothing. He pushed off from the fireplace and stood straight. The rest, learning how to not just survive, that's something you learn when you're not spending all your energy on escape. You've been running for 14 months. You're done running now. You don't know that. "No," he said. "But I know you rode out of that town this morning instead of signing Roy Castor's paper. That's not survival. That's a decision. Those are two different things." Lena looked at him for a long time. "You're going to be insufferably reasonable, aren't you?" she said. The corner of his mouth moved. It was the closest she'd seen him come to a real smile. "Probably," he said. She looked around the room one more time. The lamps threw warm light on the stone of the fireplace, and the rough wood of the table, and the floorboards that needed 2 nails in the corner. It smelled like wood smoke and pine, and the particular smell of a place that had been built carefully and had waited. She did not let herself think the word home yet. That was a word she had learned to treat carefully, a word that meant nothing until it meant everything, and she wasn't ready to give it everything yet. But she thought possible. She thought, this is possible. And that was more than she had thought about anything in 3 years, which was enough for tonight to walk on. They were married the next morning. The justice of the peace was a stout man named Alderman Briggs, who ran the settlement's only feed store out of the same building where he performed civic duties, which meant their wedding took place beside a wall of seed catalogs and a display of bridal hardware. He read the words from a worn book. Ethan said yes. Lena said yes. And Alderman Briggs stamped a document and handed it to Ethan and said, "Congratulations, that'll be 50 cents, which Ethan paid without comment. Outside, they stood in the morning air, with the stamped document between them. Lena looked at it. Her name, Lena Hart Cross, now written in Briggs's blunt handwriting. She read it twice. Then she folded it carefully and put it in her coat pocket. "Well," she said. "Well." Ethan agreed. They rode back to the ranch in silence, but it was a different kind of silence from everyone that had come before. Heavier, more textured, the silence of two people who have just stepped through a door that doesn't open from the other side. The first week was an education in the particular difficulty of sharing space with a person you didn't yet know how to be around. They were careful with each other in a way that was courteous but exhausting. The slightly too much consideration, the slightly too formal arrangement of the morning, two people orbiting each other at a polite distance and calling it adjustment. Ethan fixed the floorboards on day 2. He was up before her and had the nails in before she'd had her first cup of coffee, and when she came out and he showed her pressing his boot to the boards, solid. "Now no creak," she said. "Thank you." And he said, "It was bothering me." And neither of them quite looked at the other. On day 3, she reorganized the kitchen. She didn't ask him first. She did it while he was outside with the cattle, moving things to where they made sense to her, putting the salt closer to the stove and the flour where the light hit it in the morning. When he came in and saw it, he stopped in the doorway. She watched him register the change. "Okay?" she asked. He looked around the kitchen for another second. "Yeah," he said. "Better, actually." And he went to wash up without another word. She stood in the reorganized kitchen and breathed. By the end of the first week, they had found tentatively the edges of a rhythm. Ethan was a man of early mornings and long working days, and he had the rancher's relationship with silence, comfortable in it, not threatened by it, not filling it unnecessarily. Lena was a woman who thought out loud when she was working through something and stayed quiet when she had come to a conclusion, which meant that in the hours when she was talking, Ethan learned to listen, and in the hours when she went quiet, he learned that the thinking was done. On the 8th night, sitting at the table after supper, Lena said, "The fence line on the north pasture is down in 2 places." Ethan looked up from the ledger he'd been working through. "I know. I've been meaning to get to it. I found them this morning when I walked out to look at the property line. I also found tracks." He closed the ledger. "What kind of tracks?" "Shod horses. 2 of them, not old." Something in the room shifted. Ethan was still for a moment, the particular stillness of a man whose mind is moving fast in a direction he doesn't yet want to show. "Where exactly?" she told him. He asked 2 more questions. How fresh, which direction did they lead? And then he stood up and said, "I'll go out at first light and look." "I'll come with you." He looked at her. She looked back. He didn't argue. At first light, they walked the north fence line together, and Ethan crouched over the tracks for a long time, not saying anything. Then he stood up and followed them with his eyes toward the tree line to the northeast. "Two riders," he said. "Came from the east. Stopped here, went back the way they came." "Someone looking at the property," Lena said. "Someone measuring it," Ethan said. That was a different thing, and they both knew it. People who were lost stopped and went back. People who were curious rode up and asked. People who measured from a distance were working a different kind of problem. Lena said it before he did Roy Castor. Ethan looked at her. Or someone he sent. "Can he do anything?" "You said the territorial court system." "What I said is that a civil debt claim would sit at the bottom of a pile," Ethan said. "That's still true, but what I didn't say is that there are other ways a man like Castor can cause trouble that don't go through a court." He paused. He could file a competing claim on the Missouri land. He could dispute the registration. None of that touches you directly, but it could take years to untangle, and in the meantime he could make a credible enough case that Douglas's estate debts are attached to the land that some people would believe him. Some people meaning who? Meaning anyone he needed to convince that you're not who you say you are. The morning air was cold. Lena stood in it and thought about Roy Castor sitting in the Hollowell Hotel drinking coffee and making calculations. She thought about the document in her coat pocket, Lena Hart Cross written in blunt handwriting, and whether that name was far enough from Clara Jean Maddox to matter. "He'll try to find me," she said. "He already has," Ethan said. "Those tracks are from yesterday." She absorbed that. "So he knows where I am. He knows where the land is. Whether he connects you to this specific ranch yet, I'm not sure." She looked at the broken fence line. She thought about what it meant that Roy Castor had sent riders to measure her land 2 weeks after she'd left Red Hollow. It meant he wasn't bluffing. It meant there was something real at stake for him, real enough to follow her 3 days west into Wyoming territory, real enough to spend money on riders and reconnaissance. "The land in Missouri," she said slowly. 40 acres east of Jefferson City. What would it be worth? Ethan looked at her. Why? Because Roy Castor is a man who moves when there's money. He doesn't chase things out of principle. She worked it through while she was speaking. Douglas bought it 2 years before he died. He said it was an investment. But Douglas didn't make investments, he made schemes, which means somebody else wanted that land, and Douglas was either the middleman or the fool. Ethan was very still. "What if Castor wasn't Douglas's business partner?" Lena said. "What if Castor was the man Douglas owed the money to in the first place?" A beat of silence. "Then the debt wouldn't be commercial," Ethan said. "It would be personal. And a personal debt can be attached to a spouse under certain interpretations of Missouri law," Ethan said. He said it quietly, the way a man says something he's been turning over and has just confirmed from the outside. Lena looked at him. "You already thought of this?" He met her eyes. "I thought it might be possible. I didn't want to say it before I was more sure." "How sure are you now?" "Sure enough." She felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the one that had lived there through 14 months in Red Hollow, the one that had eased slightly in the last 8 days, and now returned with a specificity that was almost clarifying. Fear, when it came with enough information, could be worked with. Fear, without information, just crushed you. She had enough information now to be angry instead of afraid, and anger, she had learned, was a much more useful condition. "What do we do?" she said. Ethan said, "We find out what that land is actually worth, and we find out who really wants it." He rode out to the Garrett settlement that afternoon. Lena didn't go with him. They agreed without discussing it that someone should stay at the ranch, and that the errand required someone who could ask quiet questions without drawing attention to why they were being asked. Ethan was better at quiet than she was. While he was gone, she did something she'd been planning since the second day at the ranch. She sat down at the table with a piece of paper and wrote a letter. She addressed it to a woman in Jefferson City, Missouri, her mother's oldest friend, a woman named Ruth Alderson, 70 years old and sharp as wire, and the only person in Missouri who knew both Clara Jean Maddox's history and Lena Hart's forwarding address. She wrote carefully. She didn't ask Ruth to do anything illegal. She asked her to find out who had purchased the land adjacent to Douglas Maddox's 40 acres in the last 3 years, and whether a man named Roy Castor had ever been seen on or near it. She sealed the letter. She would send it with the next rider going east. When Ethan came back, he came back with Margaret Garrett. Lena had heard Ethan mention Margaret Garrett, the woman 15 miles east. Good company, not afraid to speak her mind. She had imagined someone vaguely like herself. She had not imagined a 61-year-old woman built like a wagon wheel, with a voice like a courthouse bell, and an expression of permanent cheerful appraisal that took everything in and gave back exactly what it decided you deserved. Margaret walked into the house, looked at Lena for exactly 3 seconds and said, "You're tougher than you look, which is good, because you look tough already." Lena said, "You're Margaret Garrett." "I am. And you're the woman who rode 3 days across open territory with a man she'd known 4 days and married him at Briggs's feed store. I've been wanting to meet you since Tuesday." "It was 5 days," Lena said, "not 4. Even better." Margaret sat down at the table without being invited, which Lena immediately respected. "Now, Ethan tells me you've got a man from Missouri nosing around your landlines." "My landlines," Lena said, and the phrase felt strange in her mouth. Not wrong, just new, the way any true thing feels when you're not yet used to saying it. "Your land," Margaret confirmed, and looked at her with something direct and bracing like sunlight. "Land is land, Lena. People will try to take it because people try to take everything. That doesn't mean they'll succeed." Ethan was at the stove. He set down a coffee cup in front of Margaret, without being asked, which told Lena this was not their first conversation. Margaret leaned forward. "I know a lawyer in Casper. Good man. Handled 2 property disputes for families in this settlement and won both. If Castor's filing anything or planning to, we want to know before he does it rather than after." "You'd do that?" Lena asked. "For people you just met?" Margaret looked at her steadily. "I've been alone on this land for 11 years since my husband died," she said. "When I came out here, there was nobody. Now there's something. You and Ethan are part of the something." She picked up her coffee. "That's how it works out here. You build community or you build nothing." Something in Lena shifted. Not dramatically, not the way the big things shifted, the way small things shift when they settle into a place that was always meant to hold them. "Thank you," Lena said. "Don't thank me. Help me fix my south-facing wall before winter. Ethan's promised me his help for a week and I'm collecting." Ethan from the stove said, "I said 3 days." "You said whatever I need," Margaret said without looking at him. "I did not say that." "You implied it." Lena looked between them. She felt something unlock in her face, something she hadn't felt since before Missouri, something that had been stored away with all the other things she'd put in boxes and closed. She felt without being prepared for it, almost like laughing. She didn't laugh. But the thing that wanted to was real, and she filed it carefully in the same place she kept the rest of the evidence. Margaret stayed for 2 hours. When she left, she gripped Lena's hand in both of hers at the door and said quietly away from Ethan, "He built that house 3 years ago, you know. Porch and all. I've been watching that house sit empty and waiting and thinking someone had better come along and deserve it." She looked at Lena with the particular look of a woman who has been paying attention to everything. "You deserve it." Lena held herself together through an act of will that she considered one of her better performances. After Margaret was gone, the evening quiet settled in. Ethan sat across from her at the table with a cup of coffee he'd made too strong, the way he always made it, and after a while he said, "She likes you." "She liked me the moment I corrected her math," Lena said. "That's Margaret." He turned his cup. "She was right what she said about the lawyer. I want to write to him tomorrow. Get ahead of whatever Castor's planning." "I'm already writing to someone in Jefferson City," Lena said. "Ruth Alderson. She knows Douglas's history. If there's something connected to that land I didn't know about, she'll find it." Ethan looked at her. "You thought of that today?" "While you were gone." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "Good. Just that. Good." Not impressed, not surprised. Just the straightforward acknowledgement of a man who had decided she was capable and saw no reason to perform surprise when she proved it. She had been waiting for 14 months for someone to respond to her competence like it was ordinary. Like it was simply what was expected. Like it was in the most fundamental sense the baseline. She picked up her coffee. She held the cup and she thought about the letter she'd written and Margaret's hand on hers, and the fence-line tracks in the north pasture and the document in her coat pocket, and the fireplace behind her that Ethan had laid stone by stone before he knew who would sit in front of it. And then, 3 weeks into the life she had not dared to call a life, the rider arrived. She saw him from the window first, a single rider coming from the east at a pace that wasn't social. Ethan was out in the north pasture. She was alone in the house. She stood at the window and watched the rider come, and she made herself breathe evenly and think, rather than react. He was well-dressed, not a hired hand, not a drifter. The kind of well-dressed that meant legal or financial, the suit and document kind of man. She went to the door and opened it before he reached the porch. He pulled his horse up and looked at her with the expression of a man who has found what he was looking for and is now managing his satisfaction. "Mrs. Maddox," he said. "You have the wrong ranch," Lena said. "Clara Jean Maddox, formerly of Jefferson City, Missouri." He reached into his jacket. "I have a document from the Missouri Circuit Court." "My name is Lena Cross," she said, "and whatever you have in that jacket, you'll need to come back when my husband is present." "Ma'am, this is illegal." "I heard you," she said. "My answer is the same. Come back when my husband is here." She closed the door. She stood with her back against it, her heart running hard, and counted to 10. She heard the rider sit on his horse for a moment. She could hear the creak of the saddle. Then she heard him ride away. She exhaled. She walked to the north pasture at a pace that she kept below a run by conscious effort, and when she got to Ethan, she said, "There was a man. Court document from Missouri. He called me Mrs. Maddox." Ethan lowered the fencing tool he was holding. His face did the thing it did when he was thinking fast, not blank, but concentrated. Everything turned inward and processing at speed. "What did you do?" "Told him to come back when you were here. Then I closed the door." He looked at her. "Good call." He was already moving. "He'll be back." "Today." "Within the hour. He didn't come 3 days west to turn around because of a closed door." They walked back to the house together fast. Inside, Ethan went to the desk in the corner where he kept his papers and pulled out a leather folder and opened it and laid several documents on the table. She recognized the deed to the Wyoming land, the marriage certificate from Alderman Briggs. "When he comes back," Ethan said, "don't say anything about Missouri. Don't confirm or deny the Maddox name. Let me handle the first part, and when I signal you, I'll tap the table. I need you to bring me the deed." "What's the signal going to establish?" "That this is your land. That you are Lena Cross. That any legal action pertaining to Clara Jean Maddox, if such a person exists, would need to go through the Wyoming Territorial Court, which has no current agreement for civil enforcement with Missouri." He looked at her steadily. "Castor is trying to catch you as a woman alone. He didn't expect a husband. He didn't expect a land deed. He doesn't know what we know about his debt clause." Lena looked at the documents on the table. She looked at Ethan. She thought about the moment in the livery stable in Red Hollow when she'd laid her history out in front of him and waited for him to step back. And now, he was standing here with a leather folder of documents, having prepared for a legal confrontation he'd known might come before she'd fully believed it would. "You've been ready for this," she said. "I've been ready for this since the day you told me about Castor. You didn't say anything. No point worrying you before it arrived." She looked at him for a long time. He met her eyes without flinching, without qualification, without the slight apology that men put in their faces when they'd done something they half expected to be criticized for. He looked at her, the way he looked at everything directly, and without performing it. "Don't do that again," she said. He blinked. "Do what?" "Carry something to protect me from it. I don't need protection from information. I need a partner, and a partner shares what they know." A beat of silence. Something moved across his face, not defensiveness, something more honest than that. something that recognized she was right and was deciding whether to argue or concede. He conceded. "Fair," he said. "You're right." "Thank you," she said. "I'll tell you the next thing I'm keeping from you," he said. She looked at him sharply. "There's a next thing." "There's always a next thing," he said, and tapped the table twice. She realized a half-second later that he was practicing the signal. She picked up the deed. She held it. And despite everything, the writer on his way back, the document from Missouri, Roy Castor's invisible hand, moving pieces on a board 3 states wide, she felt in that moment precisely correctly and without any ambiguity at all that she was in the right place. The writer came back 40 minutes later. This time he dismounted. He knocked. Ethan opened the door and stood in it the way a man stands in the doorway of something that belongs to him. "Can I help you?" Ethan said. The man introduced himself as a legal courier for a firm in Jefferson City. He produced the document. Ethan took it, read it again, and handed it back. He said calmly, "This document is directed to a Clara Jean Maddox believed to reside at an unregistered address in Wyoming Territory. My wife's name is Lena Cross. If you believe these are the same person, you'll need to establish that through the Wyoming Territorial Court." He paused. "Which doesn't currently enforce Missouri civil judgments on married women with established land title in this territory." The courier blinked. "Sir, I was told—" "I'm sure you were." Ethan tapped the doorframe twice. Lena stepped forward and laid the land deed on the table where the courier could see it. Lena Hart Cross. Property registered. Date and seal from the territorial office, which Ethan had quietly done on the same day as the marriage she now realized. The same day. The courier looked at the deed. He looked at Ethan. He looked at Lena. "I'll need to report back," he said finally. "You do that?" Ethan said. The courier left. They stood on the porch and watched him ride east, and Lena said without turning, "You registered the land deed the same day we got married?" "Yes." "You didn't tell me." "I was going to tell you that evening." He paused. "And then you reorganized the kitchen, and I got distracted." She turned to look at him. He was watching the courier get smaller in the distance, his face calm and ordinary, as if they had just handled something as routine as the fence line. "Ethan," she said. He looked at her. "If Castor sends someone more serious than a courier next time—" "He will," Ethan said. "Then we need more than a deed. We need to know what that land is worth and why he wants it badly enough to follow me to Wyoming." "I know," he said. "Your letter to Ruth Alderson. How long before she could reply?" 3 weeks, maybe 4. "Then we have 3 weeks to prepare for whatever comes next." He looked at her. "And we use all 3 of them." She nodded. She looked out at the land, her land, their land, the land that Ethan had registered in both their names on the morning they'd stood in front of a man surrounded by seed catalogs, and said yes. And she thought about Roy Castor making his calculations in some office in Jefferson City, moving his pieces around a board, convinced he was playing a woman alone. She was not alone. She had not been alone for 3 weeks, and the difference between who she was now and who she had been in Red Hollow was not large enough yet to fully measure. But it was real, and it was growing. And Roy Castor had no idea what was growing out here on the Wyoming plain 3 days west from anywhere he thought he understood. He was going to find out. Ruth Alderson's letter arrived on a Tuesday 26 days after Lena had sent hers. Ethan was at the north fence line when the rider from the settlement came through, and Lena was alone at the table when she broke the seal and unfolded 3 pages of Ruth's small, careful handwriting, the handwriting of a woman who had been a schoolteacher for 40 years, and believed that how you wrote a letter said everything about how seriously you took the person receiving it. She read the first page standing up. She sat down for the second. By the third, her hands were very still on the paper, and her mind was running at a speed that had no room for anything as slow as surprise. She read it again, all 3 pages from the beginning. Then she set it down and stared at the far wall, and thought about Douglas Maddox dead 3 years, and all the ways a man could keep lying after he was gone. She heard Ethan's boots on the porch. He came through the door, read her face in the time it took him to cross the room, and sat down across from her without saying anything. He waited. She pushed the letter across the table. He read it. She watched him read it, the way she'd watched him read the courier's document methodically, completely going back once to check something before he finished. When he set it down, he looked at her with the particular expression of a man who has just had a theory confirmed and takes no satisfaction from being right. 40 acres, he said. Sitting on top of a coal seam, Lena said. Ruth found the geological survey. Filed by the Missouri Pacific Railroad 2 years before Douglas bought the land. The railroad wants that route. They've been acquiring parcels along it for 3 years. She paused. Douglas's 40 acres is the last one they need. And Douglas knew. Douglas absolutely knew. He bought that land with Roy Castor's money, with Roy Castor's knowledge, and they were going to split whatever the railroad paid for it. She kept her voice flat. Except Douglas died before the sale went through, and when he died, the land was in my name. Ethan was quiet for a moment. So Castor isn't trying to collect a debt. He's trying to collect his half of a railroad sale, Lena said. The debt was an invention, a legal mechanism to force me to sign the land over to him so he could complete the deal. How much is the railroad offering? Ruth found that too. She has a friend at the county recorder's office. Lena looked at him. $4,000. The number sat between them. In 1879, Wyoming, $4,000 was not money. It was a different kind of life entirely. It was the difference between a ranch that survived and a ranch that thrived. It was years of work compressed into a single document. That land is yours, Ethan said. That land is mine. Lena agreed. And Roy Castor has known that since the day Douglas died, and he has spent 3 years trying to get it away from me with paperwork and pressure, because he knew if I understood what it was worth, I'd never sign. Ethan picked up the letter again. He looked at the second page. Ruth says the railroad's offer expires in 60 days, which means Castor is not going to stop at a courier. They looked at each other. He'll come himself, Ethan said. Yes, Lena said. He'll come himself. She had known somewhere in the back of her mind that it was going to come to this. Roy Castor was not a man who sent other men when the thing he wanted was close enough to touch. He was a man who managed situations directly when the stakes were high enough, and $4,000 was high enough. The courier had been a testing whether she was still alone, whether she was still afraid, whether the legal pressure of a Missouri Circuit Court document would be enough to make her comply. She had closed the door in his representative's face. She had a husband and a land deed and a territorial court system that didn't owe Missouri anything. She had for the first time in 3 years a position instead of just a posture. Roy Castor was going to come, and she was going to be ready. I need to write back to Ruth, she said. I need to ask her one more thing. What? Whether there's a legal mechanism to sell Wyoming registered land directly to the railroad company bypassing the Missouri claim entirely. She looked at him steadily. If the land is mine, and we can establish that not in a Missouri court, but through the railroad's own legal department, then Castor's claim becomes irrelevant. The railroad doesn't care about Missouri civil disputes. They care about clear title. Ethan looked at her for a long moment. Something in his face was doing the thing it did when she said something that landed beyond where he'd expected. Not surprise, something closer to recognition. You've been working through this all morning, he said, since page 2 of Ruth's letter. The railroad's legal department, he said slowly. We'd need a lawyer. Margaret's lawyer in Casper. That's a 2-day ride. I know, she said. I'll go Tuesday. He said, I'll come with you. One of us needs to stay with the ranch. Lena. Ethan. She held his gaze. I am capable of riding 2 days and talking to a lawyer, you know that. She paused. What you're feeling right now is the same thing I felt when you registered the land deed without telling me. You want to handle the hard part so I don't have to. She kept her voice even. We agreed that's not how we do this. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he exhaled, not frustrated, just the breath of a man releasing something he knew he didn't have the right to hold. "You're right," he said. "I know," she said. "I'll be back by Thursday." She left Tuesday at first light. She carried Ruth's letter, the land deed, the marriage certificate, and the name of the lawyer, a man named Holt Carey, whom Margaret had briefed by sending her own rider the previous Friday. Margaret moved fast when she decided something was worth moving, for which was Lena was learning simply how Margaret operated. She rode the 2 days alone. The open land no longer felt the way it had on the first ride west with Ethan. It no longer felt like exposure. It felt like space. She had been on this land long enough now that its scale had shifted from threatening to simply real, the way anything large becomes ordinary once you've lived inside it. She thought about Ethan the whole ride. She thought about that, and then she thought about the fact that she was thinking about it, which was its own kind of information. Holt Carey was a lean, precise man of 50 who listened to everything she said without interrupting, and then asked 6 questions, all of them exactly the right 6 questions. When she answered the last one, he sat back and said, "Mrs. Cross, I'm going to be direct with you." "Please," she said. "Roy Castor's claim has no legal standing in Wyoming territory. I can establish that in 2 documents and a filing. Your title is clean. Your marriage is registered. The Missouri Circuit Court's jurisdiction does not extend to real property held under Wyoming territorial law by a married woman." He paused. "The interesting question is what you want to do with the Missouri land itself." "I want to sell it," Lena said. "To the railroad, directly, before Castor can muddy the title with any more filings." Carey looked at her with something that was almost admiration. "You'll need to authorize the sale from here. I can draft a letter of authority that the railroad's legal office in Kansas City will recognize. They'll deal directly with you or with me acting as your representative, and Castor will have no avenue to insert himself." "How long will that take?" "If I start today, 2 weeks to have the documents in Kansas City, another week for their response." He laced his fingers together. "You have time before the 60-day window closes, but not much." "Start today," she said. Carey started today. She rode back to the ranch on Thursday, as she'd promised. Ethan heard her coming and was on the porch when she arrived. He took her horse's reins while she dismounted, and she told him everything before she was fully off the saddle. He listened the way he always listened, completely without interruption, and when she finished, she expected him to say something about the plan, about the timeline, about Castor. Instead, he said, "Are you hungry?" She blinked. "What? You've been riding since before sunrise. Are you hungry?" She stood there in the yard, still dusty from the road, with $4,000 and a legal strategy and 2 weeks of uncertainty stretched ahead of her, and she said, "Yes, actually, very." He had made soup. She didn't ask when. She sat at the table and ate, and he sat across from her with his coffee, and they talked through the plan piece by piece, practically, and without drama, the way they had learned to talk through hard things as a problem to be solved, rather than a catastrophe to be survived. That was the moment. She marked it afterward, not the dramatic moments, not the ride across the frontier, or the door she'd closed in the courier's face, or the letter from Ruth, but this one. Soup at the table. A man who had been worried about her for 2 days, and expressed it by making sure she had something hot to eat. The particular ordinary realness of it. She was not just passing through this life anymore. She was in it. 3 days later, Roy Castor rode up to the ranch. Not a courier. Not a hired rider. Roy Castor himself, on a good horse in his neat suit, with the expression of a man who has decided to close a matter personally. Ethan saw him coming from the pasture. Lena saw him from the window. They arrived at the front porch at the same moment, which she suspected Ethan had timed intentionally. Roy Castor pulled up and looked at both of them, and his expression recalibrated in a way she could see, fast, professional, adjusting to the fact that there were 2 of them rather than 1. "Hello, Clara," he said. "You keep making that mistake," Lena said. "My name is Lena Cross." Roy looked at Ethan. "Mr. Cross, I'm Roy Castor. I have a legal matter to discuss with your wife." "I know who you are," Ethan said. He didn't move from the porch. "And I know what you have." Roy's jaw tightened slightly. He reached into his jacket and produced a folded document. This is a formal notice from the Missouri Circuit Court establishing a debt lien against property registered in the name of Clara Jean Maddox property. Your wife is currently claiming as her own, under a name she has no legal right to. That's not accurate, Ethan said. The document claims a debt that doesn't exist, Ethan said. You know that. More importantly, we know you know that. He held Roy's gaze. The Missouri Pacific Railroad has been acquiring parcels along the eastern route for 3 years. Douglas Maddox bought 40 acres with your capital intending to split the sale. Douglas died, the land went to his wife, and you've been trying to get it back ever since, not to satisfy a debt, but to collect your share of a $4,000 railroad deal. Roy Castor went very still. You'd have a hard time proving that, he said. Quieter now. Holt, Carey, and Casper would disagree with you, Lena said. He has Ruth Alderson's documentation. He has the geological survey. He has the railroad's offer letter and the timeline of your property acquisitions in that county. She looked at Roy with the same directness she'd developed over 14 months of handling men who thought they had leverage. You're not here to collect a debt, Roy. You're here because the window is closing and you're getting desperate. Roy Castor looked at her. He looked at her for a long time, the calculation visible now stripped of its usual smooth management showing the actual man underneath who had spent 3 years chasing 40 acres through a woman he'd decided would break. She had not broken. What do you want? He said finally. And the fact that he asked it, the fact that he dropped the legal performance and asked that question directly, told her everything she needed to know about where his position actually stood. She had thought about this. She had thought about it on the ride to Casper and back, and at the table over soup, and in the early mornings when she was thinking rather than talking. I want 2 things, she said. First, you withdraw every document and filing you've attached to that property in Missouri. Every lien, every claim, every court notice. Carey has a list. She paused. Second, you sign a statement acknowledging that the debt you claimed against that property was fabricated. Not for public record, I have no interest in destroying you. For our records only. Insurance. Roy Castor's face worked through something complicated. And if I do those things, then you and I are finished, Lena said. The land sells to the railroad through Carey's office. You receive nothing, but you also face nothing. She kept her voice even. You have 24 hours to decide. If I don't hear from you by tomorrow noon, Carey files a fraud complaint with the Missouri Circuit Court using everything Ruth Alderson collected. That's a different kind of conversation entirely. Silence. A long one. Roy looked at Ethan. Ethan said nothing. He didn't need to say anything. He was simply present, solid, and unhurried on the porch of the house he'd built beside the woman who had decided to stand in it. Roy put the document back in his jacket. He looked at Lena one more time, not with anger, she noticed, not even with resentment, with something that was almost in its twisted way respect. Noon tomorrow, he said. He rode away. Lena stood on the porch and watched him go. Her heart was running hard, but her hands were steady, and she let herself feel both of those things without managing either one. Ethan said from beside her, "That was well done." "He'll sign," she said. "He doesn't have another move." "No." Ethan agreed. "He doesn't." She turned to look at him. He was watching the direction Roy had ridden, his face calm, and she thought about the man in Red Hollow, who had told her about 2 chairs on a porch, who had broken a biscuit in half without looking, who had said, "That's your house." "Ethan," she said. He looked at her. "I need to tell you something." He waited. "When I said yes in that livery stable," she said, "part of it was running. You know that. I told you. I'm not going to pretend it was only courage because it wasn't." She held his gaze. "But I'm telling you now, standing here, it isn't running anymore. It stopped being running somewhere between the fence line tracks and the soup you made Thursday." She paused. "I don't know the exact moment. I just know it's different now." Ethan looked at her for a long moment. His face did not do the thing faces did in moments like this. In the stories she'd read as a girl, it did not soften dramatically or fill with something cinematic. It just settled, quietly, the way a thing settles when it has found its level. "I know," he said. "You know." "I've known for about 2 weeks," he said. "I was waiting for you to know." She stared at him. "You could have said something. You needed to say it first," he said. "That's how I knew it would be real." She looked at him. She thought about the particular stubborn, infuriating patience of this man who had built a house before he had anyone to build it, for who had ridden into a dangerous town and asked the question. Nobody else would ask, who had learned property law, so nobody could take what he'd built, who had registered the land deed on the morning of their wedding and made soup on Thursday and waited for her to find her own way to the word she was looking for. She found it now. She found it the way you find something that was never actually lost, just set down somewhere close by while you needed both hands for something else. Roy Castor sent his man to Carrie's office at 11 the next morning with the signed withdrawal and the signed statement. Carrie confirmed both by rider to the ranch by Thursday. The railroad's response to the letter of authority came 6 days later. They accepted the sale. They recognized Lena Cross as the title holder, and they would have a bank draft issued through the Casper Territorial Office within 30 days. 30 days later, Ethan and Lena rode to Casper together. The bank draft was for $4,000. She held it in both hands outside the bank and looked at the number. $4,000. 3 years of a dead man's scheme. 3 years of Roy Castor's calculation. 14 months in Red Hollow carrying plates and counting tips in the back corner of the diner, and believing on the worst mornings that this was what her life was going to be, the narrowing of it, the careful surviving, the keeping small. "What do you want to do with it?" Ethan asked. She looked at him. She thought about it. Not long she'd already thought about it on the 2-day ride to Casper, in that particular quiet of a decision already made. "The ranch needs a second barn," she said. "The north pasture can carry twice the cattle if we expand the water line. And Margaret says there are 2 families coming into the settlement next spring who'll need help getting established." She paused. "I'd like to be the kind of people who help them." Ethan looked at her for a moment. Then he said, "The barn first, then the water line, then the families in spring." "That order works," she said. He held out his hand, not for the draft, just for her hand. She took it. They stood there outside the bank in Casper with $4,000 and a second barn and a spring full of arriving families ahead of them, and the moment was so ordinary and so completely the opposite of ordinary that she didn't try to find a word for it. The second barn went up in the fall. Margaret Garrett's settlement added 3 more families by the following spring, and Lena helped every one of them the way she'd been helped, not with charity, but with information, with presence, with the particular knowledge of a woman who had rebuilt a life from nothing and knew which mistakes cost the most time. She became the person in the settlement you went to when you didn't know what question to ask yet. She didn't plan that. It simply became what she was. In the second year, she wrote to Holt Carey and asked him to research what else Douglas might have acquired in her name. Carey found 2 more parcels, small ones worth nothing close to the railroad land, but she dealt with them cleanly and correctly and without crisis, because she now had the vocabulary, the contacts, and the absolute certainty that she was not going to be caught by a closed door twice. Ruth Alderson came west in the 3rd year. She was 73 years old, and she said she had always wanted to see Wyoming, which may or may not have been the real reason. She stayed 3 weeks. She and Margaret Garrett sat on the porch together every evening in the chairs that Ethan had built the porch around 2 chairs side by side, and talked about things Lena could hear from inside, but couldn't quite make out which seemed right. On the last evening before Ruth left, she found Lena alone in the kitchen and took her hand and said, "You know what your mother would have said about all of this?" "Tell me," Lena said. "She would have said you waited too long." Ruth smiled. "And she would have been exactly wrong. You went when you were ready to go all the way. That's the only kind of going that counts." Lena thought about that for a long time after Ruth rode east. She thought about it on the mornings when she walked the fence line of a ranch that had doubled in size and was by any honest measure thriving. She thought about it when she sat at the table across from Ethan going through the ledger. A ledger that now had 2 columns of handwriting in it. His and hers, because she had taken over the records in the 2nd year and discovered she was considerably better at them than he was, which he had acknowledged without embarrassment, and she had accepted without apology. She thought about it on the evenings when the work was done and the lamps were lit, and they sat in the same room doing separate things, reading, mending, thinking, in the specific, unremarkable peace of two people who have decided to be honest with each other about everything, including the hard parts. There were hard parts. There were the winters that pressed in, and the seasons that gave nothing, and the arguments that were real arguments, not performances, but the genuine friction of two people with strong views about different things, resolved by the same mechanism every time they said what was true, until they found the thing they agreed on, and then they built from there. That was how they did everything. It was not romantic in the way of stories. It was better than that. On a morning in the 5th year, Ethan stood on the porch of the house he'd built and looked out at a ranch that had long since become something different from the silent structure he'd finished alone, and stared at, and felt the grief of emptiness. Lena came out and stood beside him with a cup of coffee, and she looked at the same land and said nothing for a while. Then she said, "You were right, you know." He looked at her. "About which part?" "About building it first," she said. "About the belief that if you built something real life would find its way into it." He was quiet. "It did," she said. He looked at her the way he'd looked at her across a diner table in Red Hollow when she'd set down the coffee pot, and something in her face had told him she was stronger than she looked and knew it. That look had not changed. It had only grown more certain. "It did," he agreed. She had arrived with a small bag and a history that chased her, and she had stayed until the chasing stopped and the building began. And what had been built the ranch? The life, the community. The two of them was solid in the way of things, made by hand, made honestly, made to last. She was not running. She had not been running for years. She was standing on her porch on her land beside her husband, and the ground beneath her was as solid as the stone fireplace he had laid before he knew her name. Lena Cross had come to the end of the frontier and found that it wasn't an end at all. It was the only beginning that had ever been real enough to live inside, and she was living inside it fully and without reservation every single day.